Hey world historians, welcome to the video, and this is your first video on, or note video, I should say, your first lecture. And today we are talking about how to think like a historian. So we are going to be looking at some of the tools and skills that historians use as they approach these important historical questions. And you guys will be using these skills as we go through this year. So this is really the foundation of our course. So before I get into this, I do want to just remind you that you should be in your Unit 0 digital notebook that looks like this. Okay, and as you can see, these notes, how to think like a historian, are on slide 5. So you should be on slide or page 5. Okay. They look like this. Okay, so this is where you should be as you are taking the notes and watching the video. And I realize this is kind of small, so please remember that you can come up to the zoom function up here, hit that drop down arrow, and hit zoom in. And you can even zoom in a couple times if you wanted to. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. There are two things or tasks or questions that you should be able to answer after watching this video. The first is to define the terms sourcing, corroboration, and contextualization. Okay, and those are mouthfuls, but by the end of this video, you should be able to define those. And those are the three big historical thinking skills that historians use as they're looking at the past. The second objective that you should be able to answer at the end of the video is explain how historians use those skills of sourcing, corroboration, contextualization to examine evidence and answer historical questions. Okay, so I want to start off here reminding you guys of the activity that you already have completed, which is that lunchroom fight scenario. Move this over here. So in that lunchroom fight scenario, you were trying to figure out what really happened during an event that you were not there to actually witness. And historians actually do this all the time. They're like detectives, right? A lot of the time periods and events that historians look at, there are no more first-person accounts, right? A lot of people have passed away. They're a long time ago. So they really have to think about, how do we approach evidence to answer these questions? Okay? So when historians are doing this, they have to think about what history is and what it's not. So history is someone's account or story of the past based on that person's interpretation of evidence. So really important here, guys, is that it's an account or story of someone, right? So this can change from person to person because we all interpret things differently, or we can at least. Okay, so history and the stories that we tell can be flexible. So for that reason, history is not always set in stone, right? The stories, the accounts that we hear have different perspectives because people are interpreting that evidence differently. History is also not a class where you memorize just dates and facts. You will need to know general time periods and maybe a few dates. However, we are going to be focusing on big concepts, so cause and effect, change over time. That is what we are really going to be focusing on in our course. And history is also not a class where there was only one right answer. For a lot of these questions that you will see, historians don't even know the right answer. There's a lot of multi-sided arguments when it comes to historical questions. So as long as you can support your claims and arguments with evidence, you will be A-okay. Right? So let's get into how to think like a historian. So to answer the important historical questions, like should the United States have dropped the atomic bomb in World War II, for instance, historians first need to look at their evidence, the sources that are available to them. Okay? And when they look at these sources, they look to see what a source's perspective is. What is the point of view from the source? And usually that is who wrote it, what was their situation like? Okay, so they're looking at perspective or the point of view. And they're looking to see if the source has any bias. That is a preference or a leaning toward one perspective over another. So think back to that lunchroom fight activity, right? The parents and friends of the boys that were involved in the fight would be biased toward them, right? They naturally, because they are close with the boys, lean toward their side of things. Okay? So bias doesn't necessarily mean the source is not reliable or we shouldn't listen. We just have to think about how that impacts the perspective of the person who is giving us the information. Okay? So when historians take into account perspective and bias, they are using our first historical thinking skill, and that is sourcing. Okay, so you need to know this term sourcing. That is when a historian reads and analyzes where a piece of evidence comes from, so the author, for example, to figure out if it is reliable or not. Is it trustworthy? Okay. So how do we know if a source is reliable or not? Okay, one of the big tells or keys that a source might not be super reliable would be that it uses stereotypes. And stereotypes would be an overgeneralized belief that is used to explain an entire group of people. So if you think back to that TED Talk we watched on the danger of a single story, the speaker was talking about stereotypes, right? We want to avoid stereotyping or at least focusing on just stereotypes because they do not take into account individuals, right? Stereotypes maybe have some truth to them, but they also don't take into account differences among people. So, for example, take a look at this stereotype, right, of teenagers. Teenagers are all troublemakers and should not be trusted. They are lazy and are only interested in going to parties, smoking jewels, doing drugs. They never listen. And who cares what they think? They don't even know anything about life. They just want everything handed to them. They don't work for what they want. Now, some of you might be looking at this statement and you might be saying, that might not be true for me, but I know people who were like this. Yeah, absolutely. However, notice that it doesn't say the name of a specific teenager. It says all teenagers. So this is a stereotype because it's grouping an entire group of people together and saying that all of them are troublemakers, where you guys know that that's not the case, right? Some of you, most of you, I would argue, value an education, right? You're not interested in going to parties, right? You listen, you care about what other people think, and you work really hard. So that is the danger of a stereotype. Okay. Other ways to know that your source is reliable or not is to ask, is there consistency between sources? Do the facts in your source match those in other sources? If they do, it's a probably pretty reliable source. If the facts and information contradict one another, you might not have as a reliable source, and you probably need to look at another source. Think about the author, right? Is the author qualified? Okay, so is the author an expert on the subject that you're looking into? Or did they just pull some random person off the street to get their opinion, right? If the author is more qualified, the source might be more reliable. Does the source, again, agree with other credible sources? So again, going back to that consistency. And also, does it contain any possible bias, any leaning or favoring one perspective over another? Again, there can be bias in a reliable source. You just have to be careful. Right. So let's talk about types of sources here really quickly. Sources can be one of two types. The first type is a primary source, and I think this should be review for most of you. But remember, a primary source is a document, physical object, artifact, something that was written or created during the time of study. So it was made during the time period. You could also think of this like a first-hand account. So it was made or created by someone who was there. So examples of this would be a diary entry, a speech. This video that I'm giving you, you could think of this as a primary source. A letter written by someone, an interview, even social media posts would be primary sources because they are made during 2020. And if historians went back and looked, that would be a primary source. Okay. Sources can also be secondary. And a secondary source is a source that interprets or analyzes primary sources. So they look at primary sources and think about what is this person saying? What are they doing, for example? Secondary sources were written or created by someone who was not there during the time period or event. Okay, so examples of this would be textbooks, right? The textbooks that your teachers have used, right? Historians were not alive in 1600, so they have to analyze sources and write about them that way. Are there articles? Could be secondary sources. Documentaries that you watch on TV are secondary sources because those writers and the people speaking were not present during that time period or event. So, other tools to think like a historian. Okay? Our second historical thinking skill. Once we have decided if a source is reliable or not, we've looked at perspective and bias, we then need to corroborate, and that's a mouthful. Corroboration. Corroboration is to confirm if something is true by comparing multiple pieces of evidence from multiple sources. So multiple is the key. You need to look at more than one source, right? Because if you don't look at more than one source, you only have one perspective, okay? Now, how do you corroborate? Take multiple pieces of evidence, as I just said, and you compare them. And you look at them and what they're saying, and you look at their reliability. Are both sources reliable? If they are, you probably have a good idea of what happened at an event or during a time period. You think about similarities and differences between the sources and guess or hypothesize as to why any differences might exist. Right? If you have sources that have very different accounts of what happened, you need to think about why. Is there bias? Is their perspective different? Is someone not credible, right? Think about those things. You also then need to make your own conclusions about what happened based on the information given to you in the multiple pieces of evidence. And you always, always, always support your conclusion with evidence, right? So you do have to support your claim and your argument based on what it is that you find when you compare these pieces of evidence. Okay. And then finally, that should say number 3, guys, I'm sorry, but our historical thinking skill number 3 is contextualization. And this is imagining the setting of a time period or event, the context, the setting. And we looked at this in the lunchroom fight, right? We were looking at what happened in the town that may have led to the boys starting the fight. We were looking at the school and also the cafeteria, right? The setting, where the time period, the event, where the person is growing up, how all of that impacts the story. It helps us understand why historical figures say certain things and act in certain ways, okay? And I want to talk about a few examples to show you why it is that we need to think about context, okay? So depending on the context or the setting of something, we look, act, and speak differently. So for example, right, the way that you act at school probably is different from the way that you act on the weekends, or it probably should be if it's not, right? So the weekends you're more laid back. Maybe you don't log on to Google Classroom. You procrastinate and wait until Sunday to do your work. But in class, right, the context is different. It's an environment or setting of learning. So usually you are listening more attentively. You are not using your cell phone. You are following directions, right? You're more in tune with what's going on around you versus the weekend. Now, a historical example of the importance of context, I'm going to talk about a symbol, and this symbol might be a little upsetting or jarring to some of you, but I think it's a really good example of why context matters. So I'm going to pop that up here in a second, but I want you to think about, when I pop it up, what does this symbol mean to you, and what has it historically represented? And that is the symbol here. So a lot of you are familiar with this symbol. Okay, if you don't know what the symbol is, this is the swastika. And the swastika was used by the Nazi Party, especially during World War II and the Holocaust, to represent what they believed in, the pure Aryan race and the anti-Jewish beliefs that led to events like the Holocaust. Okay, so that has a very negative meaning now, right? When we look at it from this historical context since the 1930s, that is a very racist symbol. Okay? However, that was not always the case. The swastika, before the Nazis used it as their symbol, was used for over 5,000 years to mean good fortune and luck and well-being. It was actually a pretty religious symbol as well in the religions of Hinduism and Buddhism. So there are, when you think about things produced prior to the 1930s, this was a positive symbol, right? So the setting, the time period is important to think about when it comes to the swastika, right? So monks would have the swastika painted on their heads. You can see the swastika wishing you a safe and happy journey as you're exiting a certain town, right? The hotel swastika, the hotel of good luck and good fortune. Sports teams would use the swastika as a logo, right? Can you imagine that today? No, but the context is different, right? The meaning of the symbol has been transformed, right? The United States was even using the swastika for good luck and good fortune and well wishes throughout our history. So this was a poster that you would have found, right? May our glorious flag and this lucky star, the swastika, guide you and keep you wherever you are. Right? Coca-Cola even jumped on the bandwagon and used the swastika prior to the 1930s in its memorabilia, in its merchandise. So again, context, the setting, when something is produced, made, when someone is living matters, because you can think of this in the past and think of it it's not a bad symbol, but now it means something completely different to us. Right. So that is the end of your first lecture for world history. Hopefully you got all those blanks filled in. If you need to go back, make sure to do so. And if you have any questions, make sure to come to them or come to me with them in class. And remember that your objectives were to define sourcing, corroboration, and contextualization, and to be able to explain how historians use historical thinking skills to examine evidence and answer historical questions. So now you are going to answer your learning objectives, and I will see you guys in class. Bye.